that African countries face. As we all know, fiscal space in particular is very much constrained by the dramatic rise in the cost of debt servicing, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it also wants to recognize that debt is an important mode of financing. And while there are many countries that are in debt distress, by no means should we treat Africa as a completely debt-distressed continent, and rather see debt for what it is, which is a form of finance which can help us invest towards achieving these goals. The report is also aiming to stimulate an informed conversation on how to address Africa's financing needs in the context of the international financing architecture, and addressing the structural constraints that prevent African countries from being able to access these markets predictably, as well as at affordable cost, recognizing in particular the higher cost of capital for African countries. We are also looking at some of the constraints that have emerged, including, for example, currency risk, as well as actions that African countries can take themselves to address some of the challenges around debt. Ultimately, the debt report is situated within the work that OSAA has been doing to improve the possibilities for resource mobilization for African countries. You will recall that last year's report was around the triple paradox, meaning recognizing all of the resources that are leaving the continent without being mobilized. And debt is one of those areas where there is significant room for improvement, and where the resilience of African countries can be improved through addressing some of these challenges at the global level. With those few introductory remarks, I would also just like to highlight the agenda which we will be following for today. We'll be aiming to wrap up by 11:30, but we hope to hear from, in addition to our panelists, also from other people who are in the room, and also those that are connected online. This is a hybrid event. I would like to remind everyone who are connected online to please keep their microphones muted unless they are given the floor, and simultaneous translation and simultaneous interpretation is also available as usual, both in the room and online. So immediately I would like to start our event by inviting the Undersecretary General and Special Advisor for Africa, Ms. Cristina Duarte, to deliver her opening remarks. USG, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much, my dear brother, for being here with us in the launching of such important report, as Jean-Paul mentioned, challenging the debt approach, Africa's debt narrative, and Africa's debt, let's say, interpretation by third parties. And also I would like to thank in special the panelists that accept to be with us today to discuss such hot issue for Africa. So, protocols observed. I will deliver my remarks. The prevailing discourse on Africa's economic challenges centers on debt distress. Mainstream opinions and international reports attribute this distress to excessive borrowing and fiscal mismanagement. This is the common narrative that we see almost in every and each report. By focusing on these factors, I strongly believe that the conversation narrows to address debt distress alone. This narrative casts Africa as a continent perpetually on the brink of financial ruin, shackled by its creditors' demands. The prevalent image is of impoverished nations burdened with high interest rates and loan repayments, equating over indebtedness with Africa's financial woes. This conventional explanation overlooks, in my opinion, a broader spectrum of underlying issues. Africa's debt distress transcends over-indebtedness. It is fundamentally about the mismanagement, ineffective use of its own economic and financial flows. OSAA has challenged the simplistic over-indebtedness narrative and ventures into the less explored areas of economic management, illicit financial flows, institutional reform, and inequitable international trade and financing systems. By illuminating these aspects, we aim to foster a discussion that elucidates, is true, but above all, empowers. OSAA's narrative posits that Africa's economic future hinges on more than managing debt. This is our position. It is about reclaiming control of its financial resources from global, regional, and national structures that have historically governed the movement of wealth within and beyond its borders. So one of the main goals, aims of Africa's narrative around Africa's debt distress is exactly to come up with to question, as I said, the over-indebtedness explanation. Africa's debt figures reveal, we all agree, the severity of Africa's financial issues. And over-indebtedness is often cited as the primary problem, but it might not be the fundamental issue. To understand why African countries struggle to manage debt effectively, we need a political economy approach that examines the broader socio-political and economic structures, policies, and power dynamics, and shape how African countries incur and manage debt instead of just focus on technical metrics. International comparisons help to demonstrate the bias in using over-indebtedness as an explanation for Africa's debt distress. When comparing regions, we see that many developed countries operate with high debt to GDP ratios without being labeled as over-indebted. The reason for this is that the flow ratios put these same countries in a highly comfortable situation in terms of guaranteeing the debt service, an element often missing in Africa's debt sustainability equation. Conventionally, a debt to GDP ratio above 55% for developing economies is seen as a warning sign. Yet, countries like Japan and Germany do not face the same scrutiny, or dire predictions often associate with African nations that have much lower ratios. And we need to understand why. These discrepancies raise questions about the fairness and applicability of the same metrics across diverse economies with different structures, strengths, and vulnerabilities. In African economies, the debt to GDP ratio, which is a stock ratio, fails to capture the full picture. Africa's GDP, as we know in the debt to GDP ratio, Africa's GDP is the denominator, and has been constrained, the denominator of that ratio, has been constrained by an international trade system that perpetuates the commodity export trap, where the continent relies heavily on exporting raw materials with little value addition. So this system restricts GDP growth. When GDP growth is weak or stagnant, even modest levels of debt, denominator, can appear excessively high, leading to a cycle of debt distress. Essentially, Africa's debt distress is a result of the denominator, the GDP, not the amount of debt, the numerator. We need to shift the focus to the denominator. Africa's GDP statistics fails to capture all the economic and financial flows that the continent produces, painting a picture of weak economic fundamentals despite its natural resource wealth. Therefore, it is a flow challenge, not a stock challenge. And consequently, the explanation for Africa's debt distress cannot be slowly attributed to over-indebtedness. Africa has been paying a high price for this label. A study of sovereign bond issues from 2000 to 2014 found that sub-Saharan African countries pay an African premium of nearly 3 percentage points more in interest than justified by loan lengths, credit ratings, and macroeconomic fundamentals. This resulted in African governments paying around 300 million in unjustified interests annually, leading to a net loss of $2.2 billion on 14 billion worth of loans. So by focus on these ratios as the ultimate measure, the global financial community overlooks the systemic issues that prevent African countries from enjoying financial flows commensurate with their economic potential. To truly understand and address Africa's financial challenge and how the financing for development model as we speak today is broken, we must look beyond debt figures and consider the broader economic and financial systems at play. We need to bring to this conversation and to understand the lack of control of over economic and financial flows, which is Africa's root cause of debt distress. And as we mentioned in our 2023 report, we need to understand how come Africa loses $500 billion on an annual basis, which is a flow, when compared, for example, with the $654 billion external debt to GDP in 2022, give us a very small payback of 1 year and 2 months, where the over-indebtedness narrative, of course, does not fit. We need to recognize that indeed Africa has the ability to generate economic and financial flows. Africa has not the ability to mobilize them. What is the missing piece between having the ability to generate and the inability to mobilize? The missing piece, as per our narrative that we have been advocating in a strong way, are weak country systems and institutions, starting for weak domestic resource mobilization systems, to shift the financing for development paradigm from externally driven to internally driven. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, USG. And I would just like to say that we very much appreciate the fact that you've underlined it's a question of fairness, but also a question of how we can reinforce the capacity of countries to mobilize their own resources as a means of better preparing for the future challenges that are before us. And in a sense, the current environment around debt, and you have given some very good examples, and for example, the cost of capital, it has institutionalized almost the way in which resources are transferred out of the continent, linked to the economic models that are being pursued. So strengthening country systems is going to be critical to those solutions. I would now like to move to invite His Excellency Mukhtar Abakar, the permanent representative of Chad to the United Nations, and the chair of the African Group in New York, who will be delivering these remarks on behalf of the African Group. Your Excellency, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Adam. Distinguished delegate and participants, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Ms. Cristina Duarte, the Undersecretary General and Special Advisor on Africa, for inviting our group to this event and for inspiring welcoming remarks. I am delighted to participate in this global launch event for OSA's 2024 flagship report entitled Unpacking Africa's Debt Towards a Lasting and Durable Solution, and deliver these remarks on behalf of the African Group. I commend OSA's efforts in bringing together diverse stakeholders to discuss the pressing issues of development in Africa. Few issues are more pressing than debt burden on African economies, which is restricting their capacity to invest in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Agenda 2063, our collective vision for the Africa we want. This timely report comes as most African countries are still grappling with the socio-economic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic, alongside additional challenges posed by geopolitical tensions and climate change events. These crises have restricted Africa's access to international capital markets and increased debt service costs. Alarmingly, debt servicing costs have surged to a historic level, reaching $89.4 billion in 2024, further constraining fiscal space and reducing public spending on critical sectors such as education, health, and infrastructure. The flagship report dispels myths about African debt and provides historical context on Africa's debt from pre-independence to post-independence. It shows that although Africa's external debt has grown significantly, reaching $656 billion in 2024, it remains at 28% of GDP, which is lower than that of other developing countries. The report highlights the inequities and dysfunctions of the international financing systems, which exacerbate Africa's debt challenges by diverting vital resources away from development. At the same time, the continent faces a large financing gap for SDGs estimated at $1.6 trillion. It is within this context of substantial financing needs that the African Group stands united in calling for ambitious reforms to the international financial architecture. We envision a financial system that no longer marginalizes Africa, but instead empowers it, creating pathways for sustainable development that release our economies from cycles of dependency and debt. Our call for change is not merely a response to crisis, but a foundational shift. This includes the reform of global debt mechanism and enhanced international tax cooperation to ensure that financial flows truly support Africa's growth and resilience. Along with this recommendation made by the report, in the interest of time, let me highlight at least three key interventions. First, there is a critical need for affordable debt instruments, particularly concessional long-term lending through the multilateral development banks, to ensure predictable debt sustainability. We encourage international financial institutions to consider offering local currency lending more widely to shield African countries from currency risk. African countries in debt distress need debt relief, including restructuring, liquidity support, reduced borrowing costs, credit enhancement, debt write-offs, and debt standstill to create space for investment in the SDGs. Second, domestic policy reforms such as deepening domestic debt markets and engaging the private sector are essential. International financial institutions should support the development of domestic debt markets, strengthen regional financial architecture, and enhance countries' debt management capacities. Third, I join the UN Secretary General's call to reform international financial architecture to make it more inclusive, representative, transparent, and accountable. The inequities in the global financial system limit our access to finance and constrain our policy space, therefore endangering the achievement of the SDGs. In particular, special drawing rights should be fairly allocated to increase liquidity and fiscal space. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a moment not only for diagnosis but for transformation, to shape the legacy of a financial system that aligns with the 2030 Agenda and Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. The upcoming Financing for Development Conference in 2025 will provide us an opportunity to advocate for prioritizing debt restructuring, more concessional financing, and investment in sustainable projects to alleviate Africa's debt burden. In this respect, I'm convinced that the flagship report recommendation provide a comprehensive framework for addressing Africa's debt challenges, offering actionable insights and strategies. OSAA's flagship report sends us an urgent and pertinent message that it is time for Africa to act now to unlock the financial resources needed to improve social and economic resilience against future shocks and ensure a more sustainable path for Africa's development. I thank others for their excellent work in bringing these pertinent issues to the attention of Member States. I urge you all to read this report carefully and disseminate its findings widely. I hope this event will encourage further discussions on addressing Africa's debt challenges. We may also use this report to strengthen our common efforts to achieve a fundamental change in the international financing architecture, in particular through the process to deliver an ambitious outcome at the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in 2025. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And you have reiterated the call for fairness, but also about how debt is part of this broader financing ecosystem. And it is essential that African countries are focused on delivering a result which recognizes the current challenges, but which also is very development focused on the SDGs and Agenda 2063. I would just like to take a moment. We have just finished our opening segment. We will be having a presentation from my colleague, Mr. Kavazeo Kadiomize, the Senior Economic Affairs Officer and Team Lead at OSAA. He will present the key findings of the report. But I'd just like to take a moment to welcome Her Excellency Agnes Chimbiri Molande, the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Malawi, who will be speaking to us also shortly after the presentation of the report, as well as the other panelists who will be speaking, Dr. Mohamed Ibrahim, the Associate Minister of Finance and for Policies and Economic Affairs from the Ministry of Finance in the Arab Republic of Egypt, who is joining us online. My colleague Habiba Ben Barka, the Chief of the Africa Section from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Dr. Mishek Mutize, the Lead Expert Researcher from the African Union Africa Peer Review Mechanism, all of whom are joining us online. I would also like to mention Dr. Laila Abdul Latif, who is the Research Lead on Public Finance and Wealth Tax at the University of Nairobi, who has contributed towards the development of the report, who could not join us. She has sent a message which will be shared on our website and distributed to participants. But before we go to the panel, I hand over to my colleague Kava, who will present the report.
Thank you, JP. Good morning, good afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kava Kachomuse, Senior Economic Affairs Officer in the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. And my task this morning is to present key issues and findings of our report. This report on unpacking Africa's debt towards a lasting and durable solution examines how Africa's debt challenges severely limit the continent's ability to invest in the SDG, and it proposes avenues for addressing the problem, including needed reform of the international financing architecture. Chapter 1 of the report traces the evolution of Africa's debt to the pre-independence period and shows that colonial governments deployed an extraction-based model that focused on the extraction and exports of resources from the African continent. And debt was used as an instrument to facilitate resource extraction rather than the development of domestic productive capacity or creating diversified economies. Now, if we look at the next slide, we can see clearly that the medium and long-term debt for Africa grew from 8.2 billion in 1970 to 174 billion in 1987, an increase 20 times during the period. The composition of debt also changed from predominantly bilateral, multilateral to bonds, commercial banks, and private creditors. The next chapter on domestic debt shows a slight shift in the composition of Africa's public debt, with a share of domestic debt rising from 37% in 2007, reaching a high 46% in 2014, before declining slightly to 42% in 2021. On the right hand, we can see clearly that domestic bond issuance has become an important source of domestic debt financing in Africa. And it amounted to 305 billion in 2021, representing 11% of GDP. One problem with domestic debt financing, though, is that it tends to be of short-term maturity, only 8 years compared to 30 years for external debt. It is expensive, and governments wound up having to roll back their domestic debt, putting undue pressure on the budget. The next slide. Because of the shallowness of Africa's financial system, there has been a concern that rising domestic debt could potentially crowd out private sector credit. We tried to investigate whether that's the case for Africa by compiling the so-called severity of crowding out effect index, which is depicted in the graph that you see. It shows that the index increased, especially from 2019 to 2023. However, African countries still have enough borrowing space. They could borrow without necessarily crowding out credit to the private sector. On external debt, the graph shows clearly the phenomenal increase in Africa's external debt from around 228 billion in 1990 to 656 billion in 2022. But again, if you look at the percentage of external debt, or rather the ratio of external debt to GDP, it is very small, around 28%, considerably below the level for other developing countries. As the USG indicated, the conventional view that tends to portray Africa as a continent that suffers from debt overhang, it's erroneous. What is disconcerting, though, is that the debt servicing costs for Africa have increased quite phenomenally over the years. And as we can see on that chart, African countries now spend more on debt servicing than they do on education and health. Also, we show in the report that sovereign credit downgrade also is costly for Africa. They cost, on average, 75 billion to African economies. Another issue that we look at is the impact of currency volatility on debt. And we show that over the last, especially from 2013 to 2023, 50% of the increase in Africa external debt was due to currency depreciation. And therefore, here we underscore the importance of promoting local currency lending to minimize the impact of currency depreciation on debt. The last chapter, we look at the reform of the international financing architecture, drawing on the vision of our Secretary General. And we identify, we identify interventions in 5 key areas. One, bringing down the cost of sovereign borrowing. Now, borrowing for Africa tends to be very expensive due to exaggerated risk premium. The Africa premium, which the USG made reference to. And that is the risk perception which is not justified by the macroeconomic fundamentals. As a result, African countries borrow at 3 to 5 times the comparable rates for advanced economies. And one of the proposals that we make in the report is to convert short-term high interest rate borrowing into long-term debt of more than 30 years at lower rate. We believe this will be necessary to reduce the high cost of sovereign borrowing, thereby creating fiscal space for catch-up investment in the SDG and Agenda 2063. 2, increasing access to contingency financing. We know that the international financing architecture does not provide adequate contingency financing. One, because the current formula for SDR allocation, which is based on GDP, weight, and countries' relative contribution, is biased against Africa and does not consider the continent's huge financing requirement. And therefore, we advocate for basing access to borrowing on needs assessment contingent on income and vulnerability. We also advocate for reallocating SDR to Africa's multilateral development institutions. The next area is increasing access to predictable long-term concessional financing. There is a huge financing needs for investment in infrastructure and SDG in Africa. And this is a role that public development banks can play. So one of the reform proposals in the context of the IFA that we highlight in the report is the need to allow the MDBs to focus on long-term lending, 30 to 50 years, with more grace periods to allow investments in the SDGs and climate action. The fourth area is aligning debt sustainability with SDGs and debtor countries' priority. Here we highlight the fact that the current DSA debt sustainability analysis prioritizes the payment of creditors at the expense of debtors, and there is a need in the context of the reform to address that implicit bias. We should also emphasize the proposal of the SG to introduce a solvency-based analysis to complement traditional DSA. To complement traditional DSA. The last area, very quickly, moving away from contingency measures to long-term debt crisis prevention and resolution. Now, while the common framework has been an important mechanism for addressing the debt problems of African countries, it has been plagued by a number of problems. One, the mechanism leaves out many low-income, middle-income countries in debt distress and only covers bilateral debt. And as we have seen from the experiences of some of the countries that have gone through the process, like Zambia and Ghana, the debt workout mechanism can be very slow, literally locking countries in a vicious cycle of debt, losing access to finance and exports market. Very quickly, the report, contains extensive list of recommendations at both domestic and international levels, but in the interest of time, I'm going to highlight a few. As we underscored in our 2022 report on the primacy of domestic resource mobilization, there is a need for African countries to further consolidate DRM by strengthening revenue collection and addressing public expenditure inefficiency through digitalization. The pension funds and sovereign wealth funds present immense opportunity for mobilizing investment into key areas, infrastructure, climate change, etc. And therefore, there's a need to leverage these resources. Next, the importance of positioning the MDBs by optimizing their balance sheets by leveraging callable capital and advance lending to countries, especially low-income countries. So in the interest of time, I will conclude. Of course, addressing Africa's debt challenges is key to securing Africa's future. And this requires comprehensive actions at domestic, regional, and international levels. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Kava, for that presentation. And we will invite everyone also, when the report is available on our website, to please consult it. We'd also like to mention that a number of these messages also feature in the Secretary General's report on NEPAD, but the flagship report goes into significant more depth in terms of the data that is provided, and we hope that this is useful for all users of the report. We will now go to the discussion on the panel, and we would start with an intervention from Her Excellency Agnes Chimbiri Molande, the permanent representative of the Republic of Malawi to the United Nations. Your Excellency, we have just concluded the Pact for the Future, which is a historical moment to reaffirm the commitments of the international community towards a prosperous world for all, and particularly for future generations. But this will not be feasible if we cannot address the debt burden of African countries. And how do you see the forthcoming Financing for Development Conference being able to advance these objectives in terms of predictable access to financing, including addressing debt challenges? What are the main expectations from Africa for this conference? And what are the strategies or commitments that can be prioritized in terms of more favorable debt to support Africa's sustainable development? Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Ms. Christina Duarte, USG, Your Excellency, Permanent Representative of Chad, Excellencies, all protocols observed. Indeed, the just concluded Summit of the Future was a historical moment to reflect on and reaffirm the commitments of the international community for a better, secure, and prosperous world for present and future generations. Addressing the debt burden of African countries will be crucial in securing Africa's future. The conversation we are having today is timely as we launch OSAA's flagship report, and we are also currently at the UN through various platforms. We are reflecting on how we roll out the implementation of the actions agreed upon by our heads of state through the Pact of the Future and its annexes. As we prepare for the 4th Conference on Financing for Development slated for 2025, Excellencies, the existing international financial architecture does not meet the financial needs of African countries. Implementation of SDGs is lagging because of the systemic challenges of financing sustainable development. These challenges include debt burdens, trade barriers, and financial market volatility. The forthcoming Financing for Development Conference could advance Africa's aspirations if the outcome would ensure that the global financing framework includes commitments based on the following principles: right to development, common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR, no backtracking on previous commitments to ensure the 4th conference outcome builds on previous financing for development decisions, and clear distinction between climate and development finance. Excellencies, Africa's debt challenges continue to limit the region's fiscal space, especially given the high interest rates and the scary and lasting effects of the pandemic and external shocks. The 4th Conference on Financing for Development should prioritize committing on the following strategies that could secure more favorable debt terms that would support Africa's sustainable development. 1, create a multilateral sovereign debt workout mechanism aligned with sustainable development to provide a definitive solution for debt crisis. This mechanism should ensure timely, fair, and transparent restructuring processes. 2, establish a global debt authority to oversee the multilateral sovereign debt workout mechanism and promote statutory and contractual changes in sovereign debt management. This body should ensure that debt management policies align with sustainable development principles. 3, enhance the G20 common framework by focusing on debt relief through cancellation rather than merely extending maturities and reducing interest rates. It should include automatic debt service standstills during negotiations, extend eligibility to middle-income countries, clarify comparability of treatment, and provide tools to incentivize or enforce private creditors' participation. 4, suspend IMF surcharges for countries at high risk of or already in debt distress until a comprehensive review of this policy is carried out. These surcharges exacerbate financial challenges for struggling economies. 5, adopt a new approach to debt sustainability analysis that prioritizes development, focusing on long-term sustainability goals and accounting for social and environmental needs, not just economic metrics. 6, revamp the credit rating system to encourage investment in sustainable development. The current rating system disproportionately increases borrowing costs for African countries. A reformed system must accurately reflect Africa's economic realities and growth potential. Excellencies, key would be the global financial system reform. The current financial system disproportionately affects developing countries with high borrowing costs and limited access to capital. For the global financial architecture to implement the proposed strategies, structural reform of the IFIs cannot be avoided. Africa's expectations from the fourth conference would include the following. 1. Commitment to comprehensive reform of the international financial architecture, including greater representation for developing countries in international financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. These reforms must ensure that financial markets support long-term sustainable investments, particularly in vulnerable economies. Second, commitment to continue with efforts to reallocate special drawing rights to developing countries based on their needs to enhance global liquidity, in addition to exploring ways to expedite and automate STR insurance, especially in response to shocks. Third, commitments by governments to tackle underlying imbalances exacerbating debt challenges through adopting structural reforms that boost mobilization of fiscal revenues to meet priority needs, including A, improving the efficiency and effectiveness of public spending, B, strengthening business environment to foster domestic private sector as well as foreign direct investment, and C, developing domestic financial markets to enhance access to financing. Fourth, commitments by the IFIs to adopt new innovative financing mechanisms that would provide new solutions to insolvency problems, including, for example, a greater use of risk-sharing instruments by bilateral and multilateral partners to incentivize new or higher inflows from private creditors, and B, reforms of the IMF's charges, surcharges, and access limits policies. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, and thank you for this very detailed summary of many of the working streams for African countries ahead of Financing for Development 4, with a particular focus on those elements relating to debt. And we very much look forward as OSAA to working with you to further refine those and also create that linkage between those reforms that need to happen in terms of the international financing architecture and the strengthening of country institutions and capacities and domestic resource mobilization so that we have a truly developmental financing ecosystem using national resources as well as access to international financing. We'll now proceed to our online panelists. And I'd also just like to recognize Paul Akiwumi, my good friend, the Director of the Division for Africa LDCs and Special Programs at UNCTAD. Paul, great to have you with us, and please feel free to jump in after our panelists if you want to add something. But I'd like to start with Dr. Mohamed Ibrahim. How does from what we've heard so far and from your own perspectives working in the Ministry of Finance of the Arab Republic of Egypt, how does the current international financial architecture impact Africa's ability to sustain its debt and access sustainable and affordable financing? And what specific aspects of the architecture are disadvantaging African countries and should be prioritized in reforms? Over to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for the question. And actually, first of all, allow me to thank His Excellency USG and all the permanent representatives in the room. I'm really pleased to participate in this event. And back to your question, the current global financial architecture does not support developing countries, especially African countries. When it comes to the role of this group of countries in decision-making in the international financial institution, and the available resource, we find it's very limited. For example, if we remember the 650 billion special drawing rights issued by the IMF, Africa received just 33 billion, around 5%. Moreover, the effect of the global shocks is much more painful for the most vulnerable communities that are taking part in, have not taken part in creating this crisis, and this was very clear in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the COVID-19, and the impact of climate change. In time of crisis, it became very challenging for African and developed countries to access international markets and find the needed resource at affordable rates. In addition, the emerging and fragile financial system in many African countries prevents them from accessing a global capital for a favorable term, and in addition, African countries are often excluding from certain international financial mechanisms. Actually, if we tackling the global financial architecture, it will be very crucial to avoid from potential international debt crisis. And actually, this requires equitable representation of developing countries, especially African member states in international financial institution decision-making mechanism. Currently, debt resolution processes are often slow and favorable competitive, putting African nations in cycle of high debt and limiting fiscal space. If we go for multilateral development bank, we should encourage them to better serve the need of borrowers and other stakeholders from global south. And the scope and the scale of development challenge have evolved, and this including global threats like climate change and pandemic, and it has become clearer that the international financial institutions need to extend their mandate, resources, and expertise to effectively tackle the new threats. African countries pay a substantially higher interest rate on sovereign debt compared to countries in other region, despite having relatively lower debt to GDP ratio. And this Africa premium, if we can call it Africa premium, is higher due to global credit rating methodologies that often mispresent African risk level, making borrowing more expensive. Furthermore, a larger proportion of Africa debt is demonstrated in international currencies, exposing these countries to exchange rate volatility. When the international currencies appreciate, African countries face raising debt services in local currencies term, putting significant strain on their budget. A multilateral development bank and other financial institutions should work on reducing the exchange rate risk. Moreover, access to the concessional financing for both lower and middle income countries and greater flexibility in debt structure and introducing of more effective mechanisms to address climate change are needed to avail needed resources to meet the sustainable development goals and address climate change challenges. Also, implementation of more flexible and equitable debt restructuring mechanism, including debt relief, debt swaps for nature and other kind of investment is needed. In this regard, I would like to recall the Egyptian initiative, the Sustainable Debt Coalition, which was supported by the OSAA as its temporary secretariat. The coalition is a platform for like-minded countries to join addressing the critical intersection of debt, development, and climate change to generate a widened and necessary fiscal space for developing countries to pursue their development and climate ambitions. This platform is important to achieve their socioeconomic development goals and plans. By addressing these issues and advocate for a more equitable, inclusive global financial architecture, Africa can enhance its resilience, accelerate its development, and ensure its sustainable future. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, and thank you also for recalling the Sustainable Debt Coalition, which was launched by Egypt at COP27. And I think one of the key elements is that having more countries speaking together and in a unified manner on these issues will be extremely important. And you have also recognized that the challenges of debt, particularly in Africa, goes beyond low-income countries, and there's also huge strain on a number of middle-income countries. And currently, the architecture doesn't necessarily recognize this in terms of supporting those countries, as well as addressing the issues of risk premia and the currency challenges in terms of the mismatch that countries are facing, and the lack of flexibility in restructuring mechanisms when countries are facing difficulties, all of which perpetuate the challenges around debt management. Thank you so much for those points. And I'd now like to go to Habiba Ben Barka from UN Trade and Development. Habiba, the report has obviously highlighted the currency depreciation being a major driver of the increase in African debt servicing costs. And the report recommends local currency lending to help mitigate these risks associated with this volatility. And from your perspective and based on the work of your organization, what practical steps can be taken by governments and financial institutions, and how can multilateral development banks and other international partners help address some of these issues?
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to thank OSAA for inviting UN Trade and Development to be part of this launch. And again, congratulations to OSAA for launching such an important and topical report. It's very topical because we know all the challenges that African countries are currently facing. We've been through so much crisis in the world that has affected the fiscal ability of many countries, not only African, but also global countries which are partners of Africa in terms of both creditors and lenders. So it has affected a lot of African countries, but we are trying to see how best African countries can mitigate some of those risks. And as your report rightfully identified some of those issues, there needs to be a need to promote or foster more domestic sovereign bonds or domestic borrowing in local currencies. But of course, those come with some risk that your report has also well identified. So I won't dive too much into those ones, but there are two critical issues that I would like to highlight here. First is that there's an imbalance, basically, in a lot of countries, an imbalance between the trade balance and the debt servicing ability. Because of the crisis that happened around the world recently that has affected trade, export of African countries, that of course we know has affected also the reserves, foreign reserves and liquidity abilities, which as we know, when you have a low reserve, foreign reserve, you are really constrained in servicing your debt, which is, as your report showed, it's highly denominated in foreign currencies and not in domestic currencies. So borrowers on the continent or creditors on the continent are facing a lot of those issues in terms of if I borrow in a hard currency, how would I be able to service or reimburse in my domestic currency that has been basically fluctuating against a foreign currency or a hard currency. So a lot of governments have now looking at shifting the focus more on how can I then borrow in my domestic market where I have more control in terms of fluctuation of the currencies, but also to see, even if I'm able to do that, how can I attract investors into my domestic market? Because most investors will be interested into hard currency borrowing than African currencies borrowing. So, but there's opportunities there, and the opportunities is basically the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the regional integration that we are moving towards on the continent. And for African countries, African businesses, African traders, African governments, or African investors to look at, do I need to borrow externally, or can I just invest cross-border? And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement provides facilities for that under the investment protocol. But at the domestic level, or even at the sub-regional level, also there needs to be more support towards those that goal or that mission or that not that mission, but at least achieving this sophistication of our domestic markets. So two issues that I would like to recommend, which your report also talked about, is basically what could be the role of government, but also for international or regional financial institutions to support basically the growth of local currency borrowing on the continent. One aspect could be, like I think Ibrahim's, Mr. Dr. Mohammed mentioned it briefly also in his intervention, is to look at how do you facilitate some of the derivatives such as currency swaps arrangements, also looking at probably some of the partial guarantee schemes that development banks on the continent can facilitate in partnership with the government. So when a lender or a borrower would like to either issue a bond in a local currency, or a lender would like to invest into a bond, is able to see what are the mechanisms that can basically lower or reduce the risk of currency fluctuation, even between African currencies. So those are some of the mechanisms that some development banks on the continent have been really pushing forward and working closely with the African government to promote that one. But the others, not the flip side, but the gap in that one is that we don't have a lot of domestic investors that are really attracted to those type of investment tools. But we have a lot of capital spending sitting on the continent, but we are not investing probably in the right tools. And the right tools sometimes may seem a bit risky, because we see, okay, why would if I'm, let's say, from South Africa, South Africa is not the right case. Let me take my own country. If I'm from Mali and I have to invest, let's say, in Nigeria, I will be a bit worried about the fluctuation between the CFA and the Nigerian Naira, sorry, and the Nigerian Naira. So those are some of the risks that an investor will be really skeptical or will not be risk averse enough to take. But when we have those facilities in place that are supported by the development banks on the continent, but also by other financial institutions, and in partnership with the governments, then the other issue is now which type of investor would be interested in investing to that one. And the institutional investors on the continent have enough liquidity, enough capital sitting that can be invested in those type of investments. So to facilitate the growth of the market, you have the pension funds, you have the insurance companies, you have the mutual funds that have a lot of liquidity or capital assets that they can invest. But for them also, it's not an easy task, because some of the regulations are a bit too strict that will not enable them to invest, let's say, more than 5 or 10% of the assets under management towards those type of investment instruments. So we need to look at also some of the regulation that will facilitate some of those cross-border capital movement, but also to facilitate investment into some of those sophisticated financial instruments such as derivatives. And then last one, I don't want to take too much of the time, but last one recommendation could be for the development banks also in partnership with the African government to see how best do we facilitate basically the cross-border the movement of cross-border capital on the continent, and how do you make your company more attractive in terms of investment? And I see my good friend Mishek here who will be probably touching onto that one, so I won't dive into that aspect of how do you make yourself basically creditable as an asset manager, as a company, or as an investor. But those are aspects that probably Mishek will take on looking at what type of, how do you become credible basically in front of your investor, or how do you become resilient as an investment company or as a fund when let's say an African private creditor would like to, or private investor would like to invest into your assets. So those are some of the aspects that really we need to rethink. And the report that we are launching today, that's what I'm saying, it's very topical and timely, because it will help us as an African. How do we look inward and see how do we address our own issue? How do we leverage all the assets that we have on the continent to make sure that we are able to become resilient to when the global shocks around the world affect our markets, affect our ability to invest, to mobilize capital, and to invest in our own sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Habiba. And I think we all could not agree more that we need to deepen the domestic capital markets across the African continent. And you've spoken about some of those tools, including the role that multilateral development banks can play themselves, but also what countries can do. And I think that is, again, that linkage between stronger country systems, regional institutions, and the AFCFTA is a chance, is an opportunity for us to really tap into this regional pool of capital and create more resilience across the continent. Our final panelist, Mishek, thank you so much for your patience. And I know that APRM has been doing a lot of work on credit ratings, which are costing African economies approximately $75 billion in lost resources that could have been invested. And these ratings significantly impact the debt challenges by increasing borrowing costs and also shaping investor perceptions. And it's very difficult to break this negative perception, this doom cycle that sometimes appears around Africa's economies. So what measures can we take to further address these limitations? And how do you envision the role of the African Credit Ratings Agency to influence Africa's credit profile? So over to you, Mishek, in 5 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Paul, for inviting the APRM. And let me also recognize Excellency, Madam Christina, for this excellent work. The reports that you are launching, very, very critical. And you touch at the core of some of the issues that we have been advancing over the past few years. I'm very glad to see my brother, the Assistant Minister, Mohammed, and also Habiba. We have been very passionate about this work in Africa. So in my intervention, I think most of the ground is laid with the panelists who have gone before me. But I would just want to mention a few positive perspectives before we really raise some of the challenges that we have been facing with credit ratings with regards to how we can advance the positive side of the perspective that formulate the investors' sentiment. There's issues to do with investor relationships or managing investor relations and providing reliable data. It's something that we have always used our platforms to encourage our member states that it's one of an undermined article within the frameworks of government agencies that play that role, but it is very, very instrumental in changing the perception of investors that this information must be available on their public platforms, on the website of ministries of finance and central banks, so that investors, when they mention the issue of transparency of data and up-to-date data, this data should not be very difficult to process and make it public, as well as just the effectiveness in responding to investor requests, including the rating agencies themselves, because that's where the issue of lack of transparency normally emerge. So it's one area that we have been working with governments to encourage them. The issue of strengthening the domestic financial market has been mentioned, but specifically I would want to add one area that is also very important. When government displays confidence in its own domestic financial market, despite maintaining the balance with also not crowding out private sector in the domestic financial market, it's important to activate government's participation in these platforms, including the issues of cross-listing instruments that can activate the necessary liquidity in those domestic financial markets. Then thirdly, I would also want to mention, where most of the problems in our African government emerges is in the Eurobond financial market space. Most of the governments that don't have significant exposures in the Eurobond market, they are not facing a lot of challenges with credit ratings and perception of high risk or Africa premium. And also the few that are in the Eurobond market, although now there's no question about it that it's an unsustainable market to continue issuing instruments and seeing it as a very critical way of funding our fiscals or our fiscal balances. But within the framework of how this Eurobond market is structured, you find that the majority, if not all, of the instruments that are issued by African governments have been oversubscribed. So it speaks to the confidence that the international market has got in African instruments. Sometimes they are classified as high yield bonds. But to us, we always encourage governments that there is no reason to renounce the capacities or renounce the whole process of bond issuing into the syndicates that manages that process completely without managing some of the levers that should remain in the government control to ensure that these bonds are not just oversubscribed, because oversubscription is a sign that something has been overpriced. Let these bonds be negotiated in terms of the tenure, in terms of the interest rate and the yield, because once it's oversubscribed, you can use that as part of the leverage into your Eurobond book to get favorable interest. I think Egypt has been one of our flagship examples of negotiating an oversubscribed loan book or Eurobond book to get good interest rates. Then coming to the issue of, or the side of the credit rating agencies, we have so many areas that we've been raising with them, but I'm glad that at this particular point where we engage them, they do accept and acknowledge some of the shortfalls that they've been denying several for some time. The issue of transparency in methodology, I'm glad that Moody's now is conducting a series of methodology transparency workshops to make sure that they discuss the technicalities, the nuances of their methodologies with ministries of finance and central banks to ensure that they do understand the exact ways in the form of taking them through the whole process of attaching the weights and implementing the whole credit rating process as it happens. Then lastly, let me point out the issue of analyst presence in Africa. That has always been a concern of our policy organs and our principals that the big three rating agencies should have more presence in Africa and ensure that analysts have got a closer perspective of examining risk in Africa and not have a default position or instinct of wanting to discount the areas of value like economic growth and development of human capital is fragile like they've always done. And we think that this perspective will change once they have more presence in Africa and they've spent more time and widened the scope of their review during their routine engagements with government. So let me pause here and I'll be glad to speak more if there's still more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mishek. Thank you so much for those perspectives and highlighting in particular the role of transparency. And I think that's both from the side of government, but also on the side of credit rating agencies. And looking at access to these pools of finance as something that is to be developed and which has to be then allocated as well to priorities that are decided by governments and not and encourage a proactive stance from African countries where they're not just accepting what potential partners or creditors are saying, but actively engaged in relation to their priorities. We only have a few more minutes, but we'd love to have any comments or questions that may come up in the floor, in the room, or either online. So please feel free to raise your hands if you would like to make any interventions or ask any questions of the panelists. The floor is currently open. My colleagues will advise me online if there are requests. Yes.
Thank you, JP. There was actually a question submitted on Twitter, and it was addressed to USG Duarte, and the question is on what you have said about the focus on flows versus stock. Why does that matter in an African context? And it's from an anonymous user on Twitter.
The question is addressed to you, USG. I don't know if you'd like to take it.
Yes,
Please.
Yes. It's a great opportunity to clarify. And I will give you the example of Cape Verde. I have been Minister of Finance for 10 years, and planning and public administration. And basically my journey in terms of managing Cape Verde's public debt was very simple. When I land, I decreased the ratio, the stock ratio was 86. I decreased to 56 intentionally because the 86 was essentially debt to finance current expenditures. I hope I will not provide us too much technical explanation. May I proceed? Okay. Okay. So, my apologies. So I decreased from 86 to 56 to create fiscal space and basically to move away debt financing from current expenditures to capital expenditures. That was mine. Then I made an agreement with the World Bank and IMF that I would start increasing intentionally, not because I was distracted, intentionally the public debt. And I promised to the World Bank and IMF that I would only take concessional financing. And by taking concessional financing, I would go intentionally to the 55% cutoff line, intentionally, but which is a stock approach, but promise to keep the two ratios flow, debt service to exports and debt service to budget revenues within sustainable levels. And this is what happened. In fact, when I left government, proudly, the ratio was 120%, proudly. So the debt to GDP ratio, as I say, I was not sleeping intentionally. I worked hard to get there, the 120%, and stock ratio. And the two ratios, the flow ratios, despite being 120% ratios, the two flow ratios, debt service to export, debt service to budget revenues, were within sustainable limits, within the comfortable zone of World Bank. The profile was the following. Basically, the average interest rate was 1.4%, despite being a 120% ratio, 1.4% average interest rates. The grace period the average grace period was 10 years, and the average maturity was 25 years. So this is the difference between manage only based on stock and manage essentially driven by a flow approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, USG, for that clarification and also for the question, which I think is very important. And I would say in these discussions, particularly as we go towards FFD, we have to marry the public policy space in a general way as well as very technical arguments. And I think this is something that OSAA is looking forward to working with both groups that are looking at these issues very technically as well as policy partners that maybe not be debt experts, but we have to link this to the financing for development conversation in a way which is impactful. And I think what the USG's explanation, I think, particularly highlights as well is the challenges with the current debt sustainability analysis framework, which is currently used by the international institutions, which would, in the majority of cases where countries are facing borrowing decisions to be made, there is not enough appreciation for, firstly, the various aspects, for example, of how low cost that debt might be, the tenure, but in particular where that debt will be invested and the impact that that can have in terms of strengthening country systems for future revenues that governments can potentially access. And I think that's one of the main challenges that we need to address as well in the context of the debt sustainability analysis and in how we address these issues. I'm very conscious we did start a few minutes late. I do not see requests for the floor, so therefore I'm so sorry. Please, over to you.
My question is how to make the elimination of debt profitable for sustainable development in a context of insecurity, particularly in the country of the Sahel, and without sustained global solidarity to put an end to insecurity in the Sahel and in other parts from Africa and the world.
Do you want to address it to a particular person or generally? Generally. May I, Habiba, I think maybe, I don't know if you heard the question, but in the context of the insecurity that we are currently facing, for example, in the Sahel, how do we address the question of debt sustainability and in the context of countries particularly that are facing security conflicts? I hope I properly paraphrased the question. Yes. Habiba?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. No, thank you very much for the question. We've been working on some of those fragile situations on the continent, and it's not an easy task because they face already other challenges that has nothing to do with the sustainability or the ability to mobilize investment. And so they are trying to see how best to manage all those challenges and vulnerabilities at the same time, which is not easy. In the case of the Sahel or other regional subgrouping on the continent that are going through political challenges, security challenges, environmental challenges, economic vulnerability, all the full multidimensional vulnerability that a country can go through, I think what could be going forward for those countries will be seeing how do you basically foster some of those de-risking investment mechanisms to make sure that when an investor, whether it's a domestic investor or a foreign investor, is willing to invest in a country that is basically considered by the global norm as risky, and how do you make sure that there are incentives in place to ensure that once they invest into that country, regardless of the outcome of this reconstruction of that country or the rebuilding of institutions in that country, how do they make sure that they can repatriate? I think that's the key issue with any investor. First of all, if I invest, what is the return on my investment? If it's high enough, I'm willing to take a risk. So then I can pay a premium on that risk. But the second part is that it's not every investor that has that ability to invest. We pay a high premium on the investment in a country that can be considered as high risk. So the other aspect would be if you are looking at, let's say, not very highly lucrative investors, but you're looking at sub-regional investor, even domestic investor, how do you make sure that when they invest and there's anything they want to repatriate the assets, or they can make sure that the asset will not be facing any issues, it's to put in place some regulations. So a lot of countries have been doing that one when they looked at the investment policies, the investment code of the country, to make sure that the investors is somehow protected, or the government put in place some guarantees that will protect that investment. And I think that's critical, and that's how we can attract more investment in any type of situation on the continent. And there are a lot of mechanisms that are in place, but the issue is that a lot of governments have those policies under the investment code, but those investment codes are not necessarily well known of, or they are not well discussed with the private sector or the investors. And I think for countries such as the Sahel, it might be good to look at the investment case that they currently have to see whether in a current situation that the situation in the Sahel is beyond the control of those countries or those populations. Because you have a lot of global dynamics that have been really shifting things around in that part of the continent. But it's to look at the current investment codes, whether they need to be relooked at, whether they need to be rethink a little bit to see how do we address these type of global challenges that everyone is basically facing, and to also raise more awareness about some of the incentives that are there. We keep talking about tax incentives for investors, but I think there are other incentives that may not necessarily only be tax incentives that can really push an investor or give reassurance to an investor that I can invest in that country. I don't have to necessarily pay a higher premium. There are some partial guarantee schemes that are supported by the government, but also by regional institutions to make sure that my investment is safe and I afford to have a high return on that investment. I hope I was able to respond to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Habiba. And just to, I think, conclude on this point, and I think we will have to conclude here. I think that firstly, the investability question that you've mentioned, Habiba, I think is absolutely critical. Linking to other work that OSAA has done, the challenge is also the absence of the state. And you touched on this, Habiba, and one of the critical aspects is that for all financing strategies that include debt, but it can also include nationally mobilized resources, it's about being able to invest in a way whereby the state is present in the lives of citizens and able to deliver services. And in the context of new debt issuances that countries are making, where debt is taken on board, it has to be able to be invested precisely in building these country systems, the ability of countries to support communities that are most at risk and that are affected. And this in itself is a de-risking mechanism, because in the longer term it will reduce the risk of conflict. Okay, I think we have to conclude. Sorry, if there is one more comment online, we can. I'm not too sure, but I think yes, Habiba. If we could keep it 1 minute, though, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Junior Davis. I just wanted to say, first of all, to congratulate you on an excellent report and excellent presentation. I think the emphasis of the report is right. I agree with the emphasis also on looking at the debt sustainability framework. I don't think it's fit for purpose, and I do think it needs to be revisited in the context of the discussions that will take place at the Financing for Development conference. I still don't think the debt sustainability framework adequately reflects the risks of contingent liabilities that governments face. And I don't think it adequately acknowledges the country specificities or places sufficient emphasis, in fact, on the need for really some form of payment cap on debt service as and when that arises. I haven't had a chance to look at the report in detail. I know that you talk a little bit about the declining share of concessional debt as a share of total debt. And I think that is, I think, a really critical problem. I just wondered whether you had any quick observations you could share with us about how, what the report proposes about tackling that. But otherwise, I've really enjoyed listening to your report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I will perhaps give a very quick response because I need to then hand over to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Chad, to conclude. Under the control of the USG, I don't know if she would like to add something on that. But I think one of the, as you have noted, African countries are actually finding it harder even to access existing forms of concessional debt for a variety of reasons. And we have seen that development partners are more reticent in terms of providing new forms of finance. And one of the critical challenges, I think, in Africa is the institutions within Africa able to generate their own resources. And I think this touches on a little bit what Habiba had said of how capital that is even within the continent is not being properly deployed within the continent. And I think that's one of the main areas that we need to address going forward, while also emphasizing to multilateral development banks that succeeding in unlocking finance in Africa needs, first of all, more finance. You need the concessional finance as also an incentive for other forms of finance to be further multiplied. I don't want to take too much time because we are over time, and I'd like to thank everyone for their patience and engagement on these very important issues. And with that, I would just like, of course, USG, of course. Yes. And I will directly invite His Excellency Mukhtar Bakar, the permanent representative of Chad and chair of the African Group in New York, to deliver closing remarks. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's discussion have underscored the pressing national action and ambitious reforms to address Africa's debt crisis. We thank all resource persons for their insightful presentations and contributions. The insight from OSAA's 2024 report make it abundantly clear that this is not solely an African crisis. It is a global challenge demanding shared responsibility and firm action. We must confront a debt crisis that has shackled progress and meet it with equally powerful reforms. As we look towards the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development, we must advance an ambitious agenda. Key reforms include establishing a global sovereign debt workout mechanism that allows for timely and transparent restructuring and reforming credit rating methodologies to reflect the true economic conditions in Africa. Instruments like the G20 Common Framework should be expanded and restructured to serve African countries effectively, including middle-income nations under distress. Additionally, we call on member states to support a UN Framework Convention on Tax, which would help curb illicit financial flows and promote a fairer international tax system. Our actionable recommendations call for innovative financing solutions that extend beyond traditional debt relief. We emphasize the need to allocate effectively leverage special drawing rights to support Africa's financial stability and resilience. Furthermore, reforms to credit rating system must be prioritized to ensure fair assessment of African economies, enabling better access to affordable financing. By ensuring access to predictable concessional financing and strengthening Africa's domestic and regional financial institutions, we can build resilience and safeguard progress on sustainable development. The future of Africa's development is a shared responsibility. Today, we renew our commitment to advocating for a global financial architecture that is fairer, stronger, and resilient enough to enable Africa and all nations to flourish. Today's ambition must spark a legacy of transformation that secures a strong economic future, fulfills Africa's promise under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Agenda 2063, and advance the prosperity and dignity of our people so that no country and no one is left behind. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and it remains for me just to thank yourself as the chair of the African Group, Her Excellency, the permanent representative of Malawi, our Under-Secretary General, all of the panelists that have joined us online. Thank you so much. We know it's very late for you, and thank you very much for being with us. And I would also just like to conclude by thanking the drafters within the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa, who are Kava Katyomize, Liwadin Fliss, Ray Shu, who could not be with us, and Utku Texos. So thank you so much to everyone, and thank you for everyone who has joined us for today's event. Please read the report and also send us your questions and thoughts. Thank you very much.